Maybe take 3 deep breaths just to anchor to your body that we are about to do this. And simply take some time to notice where you're breathing from. Where in your body are you breathing from? Your chest? Are you breathing from your stomach? And the invitation, if you are breathing from your chest, is to bring your breathing down into your stomach more intentionally. And stomach breathers, just deepen your breathing. And simply sustaining our breathing in a rhythm that is comfortable for us from our stomach area. I'm going to ring the bell, and when you can no longer hear the bell, please take that as a sign to return fully aware and eyes open. So, our segment for the Academy is on integral self-mastery and mindful leadership. So what does that really mean? It's definitely some teachings and learnings from having a meditation practice for over 25 years and being a high school principal for about 17 years. So I started as a baby in the work, 22 years old. No one should be in a classroom at 22 years old. Brains are undeveloped, teaching other undeveloped brains. But welcome to the educational system. That's like the smallest of our issues, right? Okay, so we're going to cover a few things today and definitely be using our equity lens. Some agreements for a short time, just really about us being engaged and staying engaged. Things could get a little bit comfortable. They often do when we talk about trauma or we talk about race-based conversations. So just really trusting that this is a safe space for us to have those conversations and talk about how this work assists us in those conversations and how critical those conversations are for the kind of work we do with so many of our kids. Okay? Accept and expect non-closure. We're not going to solve too much today. And this is a journey, and we know that it's a journey. I know that many of you are practitioners already of mindfulness and definitely seasoned educators, and so we know we're always learning. We know there's always more of whatever it is, and so it doesn't really end. Trust the process. We're going to do our best to leave you whole at the end of today. And everything presented is research-based and practice. So, yeah, that's always good to know. People like to hear that. And this is adult SEL work. And so a lot of our stuff comes up, okay, when talking about it. And so just treat it with a social-emotional lens, much like we would with our students, but how can we be compassionate as well towards ourselves? And then lastly, practice self-care, and that could mean maybe you need to stand up when we're not all standing, and that's okay, or you need to go to the back of the room, just breathe a lot, helps. So whatever it is that you need to do, get some chocolate, it's all good, ignore the camera, so everything's great, okay? Mindful leadership, so what is mindful leadership? I like to think that mindful leadership is really the heart work of us embodying not just a meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, our own self-awareness, but how do we go about it in such a strategic and methodical way that we know that it's in service of our leadership and what we're about. And so we embody a meditation practice. We cultivate our own self-awareness through that practice. We cultivate and model self-awareness when we're leading, when we're in meetings, when we're parenting, whatever that looks like. How are we practicing that? And then skillfulness at emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is also known as self-management, but how are we skillful in it? You know, it's one thing when you have the amygdala hijack and then people need to come calm you down and work the whole thing out. Not very skillful. Yes, it's learning and it's part of the process, but where do you get to that point where you can self-regulate on your own? And then what does that look like? Or does the whole room know that you're self-regulating while you're doing it, right? Being cognizant and supporting the emotional awareness of others. So how are we sitting with that and reading a space, as well as being able to hold a space and hold others, particularly in discomfort or whatever is really bubbling up. And then lastly, compassion and presence to support equity in our own work, and then systemically. Okay, by nature of the fact that equity, one, is distressing for a lot of people to talk about. So how do we cultivate a strong capacity to be with difficult emotions? And I like to think that the mindfulness practice, through the self-awareness, through the social awareness and emotional awareness, allows us to sit with difficult emotions because we're used to sitting with our own. And the more that we build that capacity and that muscle to be with challenges, the stronger we can be at disrupting, the stronger that we can be in difficult conversations that are creating distress. Doesn't mean it's necessarily less distressful. It doesn't mean that distress doesn't occur. It just means that we're smoother in it. And I kind of liken it to the image of a duck on a pond. We just see this duck just being really, really smooth, and underneath the duck's like, right? And so that's how sometimes it feels when we're leading. It's like we need to make this look poised. We need to make it look smooth and calm on the inside, even if all that's happening. And so that's regulation. All right? So starting off with our emotional intelligence piece, I do consider us all leaders. And I love this definition that Brene Brown has, that anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and has the courage to develop that potential. I wholeheartedly believe that this is the work of educators, period. Like, that's what we do. Also parents. So I use the term leadership, what some people might say loosely, I think appropriately. I think that anyone who's doing this, we are leading, okay, and we are leaders. What are some of the benefits of mindfulness meditation in terms of how we're approaching it in this segment of the afternoon? I know that some of the physical aspects have already been discussed, but emotionally, as we're talking about around regulation and awareness, is about how it improves our resiliency. It helps us stay connected to our core values. It increases our creativity, okay, keeping us in touch with our values and ourselves. Definitely, again, as I touched on, the emotional capacity to be with difficult emotions. It also builds empathy and compassion. And we'll talk a little bit about how that is done neurobiologically. And then so overall, it's increasing our emotional intelligence. Brene Brown's next book is going to be all about emotional intelligence, but she's calling it emotional literacy. So that should be pretty exciting. So I'm excited to see what this next phase is and how she's jumping past that. And then our ways of being, because with leadership we think, oh, he is so charming, or oh, he's so charismatic and he just makes us look so easy. There's a calmness that we know that we can cultivate through this practice. There's a poise and presence that comes with how do we show up, because we really are embodying this work. And for me, I call that the being aspect of it. How are we being the work? Okay. Doesn't mean you don't lose it sometimes. I laugh sometimes, like, oh, if people could see me, because I'm like, I teach this stuff. You know, but different day, different time, you just trust the process and you keep your awareness up. So a few things just fundamentally that I'd like to lay the groundwork. I know we're not in an all-day workshop, but there are some things I really need to lay out to help ground us in what's to come in the next hour. And this is the 6 circle model. And it's a model that I've grown through the other woman who designed it, who was originally Margaret Wheatley. Okay, and she developed the Six Circle model. The National Equity Project built upon it a bit. And then I built upon it in that the Six Circle model is about what's termed above and below the green line. So things that are above the green line are technical. Things that are below the green line are relational. The relational things are all about our mindset, our biases, our beliefs, our equity lens, SEL, being trauma informed, how we engage families, if we value families, that whole piece, restorative practices. That's all about who we be. It's relationship, it's identity. It's relational, it's below the green line. To go above the green line, we have the policies, rules, instruction, curriculum, design. All of those things are implementation of a mindset. All of those things are implementation of a belief system. So how you be is how you do. Okay? In the words of Brene Brown, who we are is how we lead. So when you're questioning if some of our policies, rules, our curriculum is not equitable, well, who selected it? Okay, because how we be is what we will do. So when this stuff is built on sand, that's when this doesn't work. All this is kind of futile if this part isn't there, which is why people purport in trauma-informed work, in SEL, in mindfulness work, relationship. A lot of our best educators will purport relationship first. That's why when we are in experiences together, learning experiences, there's always container building. There's always that time that we get things going. A lot of teachers are challenged in their classrooms when they just jump into curriculum. Okay? And so I really question that whole piece around bell-to-bell instruction. And after 17 years as a principal, people are shocked, and I'm like, down with bell-to-bell instruction. It's about bell-to-bell experience. Okay, how are we creating an experience where our children and the adults are feeling grounded enough from bell to bell, all right, and safe enough? So relationship counts. The other piece is a model around a growth order of operations, and I call it a good framework. I would purport that, of course, we know how educators are being prepared and how we're prepared to go into our system, that we always start up here. We always start up here. This is the easy part. It's down here where people are challenged because we're not starting with relationship, we're not starting with self-awareness. So when people are coming into education and not doing our self-work and our self-growth in literally the most important profession there is that deals with all of humanity, but we're not working on human development, that is where I feel like we need to start. And then we go into the competencies behind the intelligence. Then we go into relationship development on the outside. When we focus on these things here, we're developing inner resilience. That's where we're learning our inner resilience, because mindfulness, trauma-informed, all that, it creates resilience. And we're going to get into that later around the self-regulation piece. So that creates inner resilience. The environment is simply the culture climate of our schools. If your school doesn't feel good, the below the green line is generally not being dealt with. Okay, when morale is bad, below the green line isn't there. When we have inner resilience and we're cognizant of how our inner resilience has been created and been nurtured, then we help others with their outer resilience, which is literally like at the school. How do we bring that into lessons? How do we integrate? Okay, are you all following me? Okay, and then of course we just enrich it all with the equity lens throughout.
Will you be sharing this PowerPoint? I have to have this.
You
slide.
will. I know.
I will.
have this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so
I
much.
think Tracy would chase me with a bat. So the equity lens, the piece on equity I want to be really clear about in culture climate, it's not always about Black and brown students. If that's not your population, that's fine. Culture climate and your equity lens needs to be reflective. That's what it means to be culturally responsive. Are you being responsive to the cultures that you are serving? Don't let me get caught up in the percentage points. That's not where I'm going either. Can't be like, oh, we only have like 0.5% black children. No, if there are black children in the space, then you need to have some culturally responsive strategies. Okay, so it's not necessarily like the continuum of the amount, it's whoever is there. Okay? All right, woo! All right, here we go. And then lastly, and you all know this already, we have to be authentic in this work. The kids know when we're faking it. Okay? They know and they feel it, which is how we came up with this last line that's in the article, how can we teach what we do not know or embody? Okay, which is why we have to do our own work. And it starts with us first. Okay, so I venture to say SEL is not soft, SEL is connected. So for all our colleagues that say, oh, that's soft, no, it's connected. And folks who have a challenge with connection have a challenge with this type of content. Folks that have a challenge with this type of content generally have a challenge with all right? Okay. So, moving into emotional regulation. People familiar with the castle wheel? Okay, good. So, I just use it there as part of the image that talks about how we know already that mindfulness is foundation to learning the skills and strategies to manage what we're all dealing with in our challenging jobs and work. And it requires us to show up as our best selves. So for us to carry the weight of what our profession requires, we have to hang out in these two areas of the castle wheel most frequently in order to do these areas well. Okay? So just really want to drive that point home. I'm going to give you the slide.
I'm gonna get it.
And I want to just name that a lot of our teachers are getting burnt out. A lot of our teachers are leaving the profession. It's also that we're not getting people in the profession. So burnout's not just happening because there's a teacher shortage, right? And that burnout's correlated to our classrooms being disrupted. The real issue is that the more the teacher becomes dysregulated, the more chaotic the classroom gets. Okay? That chaos results in re-traumatization and toxic emotions in the space. I love this chart. I designed this part, but it really comes from, it's emotional exhaustion at the core. That's what leads to the burnout. Folks are just exhausted and drained. When we get emotionally exhausted is when we depersonalize and start to say we don't have time for connection. We don't have time for this stuff. Because the tank is so empty that we will go into depersonalization. From depersonalization, we're now disconnecting from those that we serve, which makes us feel like we're not being as effective in our work. Because we're not anymore. Because we've literally disconnected and we're in survival mode. And there's no emotional connection in that, but the root is emotional exhaustion. And so I love Matt's work and Lauren's work around how we're bringing in the piece around wellness and self-care, because that is critical to keep the emotional tank full. So that quality teaching and learning can happen because the tank isn't too empty. All right, but that's generally the spiral. All right, and sadly, we're in a profession that instead of saying, oh, I can go take a break for a year because I've been able to save money, oh, well, not in this one, or, you know, I'm gonna go take a break for a year anyway, no one's like leaving and coming back.
Yeah.
They're leaving and they're going to do something else. On top of that, what's even worse, they're not leaving.
Yeah.
Okay? All right? So, how can we be systemic about our wellness? And that is critical for our educational leaders, particularly. Okay, creating systems within the schoolhouse that will support teacher wellness. 3 brain states that are critical to our social emotional learning, our mindfulness work, and teacher wellness, and trauma-informed, because it's all intersectionality, is that we have the way that we learn, and did you cover amygdala hijack earlier? Perfect.
Well, I mean, a little bit, we talked about the, yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So when we have, again, back to the below the green line model and above the green line, the emotional state and the survival state would be considered below the green line. So when we figure that, we think that kids are like, oh, they come in ready to learn, not necessarily. We have to feel safe first. Think about it. You all, when you came in this room, I know what you did this morning. I didn't have to be here. You scanned for where you wanted to sit. You scanned for safety, you scanned for who was there, you scanned for the positionality of the table, right, where the wall, all of that. Because safety and survival is always first. Dysregulated classroom, this goes away, physically and emotionally. Bullying, okay? Emotional, I feel cared for. So now we've created a safe space. How does the emotional brain, the emotional body step in and say, wow, this person really does care about me? And there's this whole piece around skillful caring that we'll talk about when we get into equity. That'll be like tomorrow. Okay, but you'll be there for it. The engaged brain is now ready to learn because they feel safe, they feel cared about, connections been made, and now they can engage. I am ready to learn and problem solve. So it's the amygdala, the insula, and the prefrontal cortex. So if we think about when we get feelings of being unsafe, our safety's threatened emotionally or physically, the amygdala is going to start to separate itself from the prefrontal cortex. We want it to stay connected, okay? Because these two need to be connected for quality thinking to happen. All right? When they're disconnected, that's when the prefrontal cortex can no longer really function. So when you're upset or a student's upset, it's time to pause. Basically, just simply pause. Okay? You all with me on this? All right. I'm going to get to it later, but the insula is the part of the brain also that gets worked in meditation. All three of these parts of the brain get worked during meditation. There's nothing that you can do about it. You can't try to make it happen, you can't make it unhappen. All right? That's the beauty of it. So then we take the pause. I love this, the sacred pause. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor. Okay? He writes about this space and how he found that space through hardship, through resilience. And how do we move explicitly from compulsion to choice? It's that pause that we take, the SBNRR. Okay? I know it sounds really like it's a lot, but it's really what the sacred pause is. We're stopping, we're breathing, we're noticing, we're reflecting, then we respond. How does it look in our book that we have? Gee, they broke it out as awareness, analysis, and choice. Okay? So in the book, in chapter 4, when we're talking about emotional regulation, these are the types of questions we would be asking when we stop and we breathe and we notice. What emotion am I experiencing right now? What's my interpretation? So you're sitting with it. Then you analyze it. What seems like the best outcome? What can I do? Maybe what can I do differently? Then how can I respond? This whole process has kept me union grievance free. That process can take seconds, minutes, and days. But it was this process that also helped me get out of my ego with someone who really, oh gosh, we oil and water the whole time because she led with the union. Everything that came out of her mouth in a staff meeting was, well, the union says. Yeah. Every time, and that was my trigger. Like, I had to be with that. Teacher unions are good things. They protect people. So it's like, what was my issue is because of the way it was, being presented. And so that was my own work. And now this is on video. Cut that out. People know it's her. So this is the process for it. It's also, and we'll talk more about this, it's the same process for debiasing. It's the exact same process. Because having a bias is an emotional response. A bias is not grounded in anything super real, okay, generally. And so it's the same type of thing. How are we going to stop, breathe, notice, reflect, and then respond? So again, it's going from compulsion, something that we would do on autopilot, to then this awareness choice. Okay. The other piece around it is self-awareness gives us our positive interaction. So again, we're back first with the relational piece. Our positive interactions around relational awareness, these are also listed in the book. How are we listening to each other? Are we being compassionate? Are we respecting personal space, encouraging and supporting others, expressing gratitude, and using manners? What part of this lacks an equity lens? Yes.
Well, the one that I saw first was using manners, because I think that could be subjective. What I grew up with as manners might be different than what someone else grew up as what manners are.
Yeah, that was the first one that jumped out for me too. Any others? There's another goodie on there.
What respecting others' personal space
Yeah.
looks like.
Can you say more on that for us?
And different people in different cultures have different views of what personal space is and what kind of physical contact is and is not appropriate and acceptable.
Exactly. So again, that's all it means when we integrate with an equity lens. It's like, okay, how are we really making it so that we're being sensitive that this may not be the same? Yes, it's published in a book. Yes, it's all that. And yes, it's all good.
Yeah.
Like, we're not saying it's not a good thing, but then we also need to be explicit about it. So that's why it's so important in the way that we use this work with our staff and with our students. How are we making this explicit? So if we're going to say using manners, then we're going to talk about what are the norms of manners in our space. Okay, instead of just relying on the fact that we're in dominant culture. Sometimes we're in white dominant culture, and that these are the manners. All right. So some other positive interaction pieces around connecting habits versus disconnecting habits are the way that we speak to each other. And is our tone caring versus are we often criticizing? Okay, are we listening or are we blaming? Are we supporting or are we complaining? When I was reviewing this list, what jumped out for me was huge, was like nagging. And I dated a fabulous man for about 8 years, and he called me a nag. I couldn't believe it. No, seriously, I couldn't believe it. But that's part of the integration. That's why it's integral self-mastery, because how we do things personally is generally also how we'll do things professionally. It just shows up a little bit differently. Dated a guy who said, "Don't principal me." Okay, which means my tone never shifted from when I left work to how I got home. So again, this is relational awareness and self-awareness. And so how are we embodying connecting habits? What does that look like for us? So I'm going to give you a few minutes in your table groups, and if you guys are a big table, so maybe go 3-3. You all are good. How do you know when you're embodying connection, and how do you know when you're embodying disconnection? Just kind of have some free flow conversation in your table groups. It'll take about 6 minutes. There are some good activities in the book in chapter 6, and if people didn't look, that's okay. There's a great activity in there that helps kids understand about connecting habits, and they're holding up papers. The reason I did not do it with us today is because I'm still working through what does it look like to create connection back into this activity. So the activity has basically 2 kids having a conversation that goes bad, where the kid is getting blamed for why they lost the softball game or the baseball game. And so the students have, these are 7 students, and each one has one of these. And so they get up and they'll come up and say a criticizing thing. So they stand between the student. Then another one comes in with another piece of paper that is blaming and stands between. So they're disconnecting further and further. When I was working it through in my mind, I wanted to bring back in connecting, but I didn't know how to bring them all back in and get the kids closer and still have the connection. So I'm thinking about maybe like a link or something. I'm saying that to really name and be transparent. Start to make those activities your own, but it's also how we explicitly teach kids about these things. Like as adults, we could talk more about it and keep it more meta up here. but our students will need it. Even if they're in high school, they're gonna need it more in practice. And then of course, what are we doing that's modeling one side or the other in our leadership in some way in the classroom or in the school? Okay, I know that when I first started on my own equity journey and leading teachers through the work and leading colleagues through the work, I was up here quite a bit. I'm gonna venture to say that either their bias or their felt sense of experiencing me was here. Okay? And a lot of times people won't say what they really want to say because of here. I mean, like, we can really start to unpack what that starts to look like and how does it show up. So how are we embodying connecting habits? The longer that I got on my own mindfulness and meditation journey, the more that I was able to embody the connecting habits, where I had my ahas and grew my own compassion, grew my empathy in a way that made me show up differently. When I would go on my instructional walkthroughs through the school, instead of me being like this, like looking for things, like, I mean, that's like an embodied walk of what are we gonna see versus, wow, okay, let's look around here. Like, you're still gonna observe, you're still gonna judge in a discerning way professionally, but it's like, it can be carried differently. That lands differently, one, in how you experience yourself and being the leader that you want to be, and two, how the receiving end is feeling that. So I encourage you to really anchor into some of those connecting habits for yourself and see what that looks like. I call it a learning edge. So like if you were going to pick one habit a month for yourself, start with one that you know is kind of ringing true for you, maybe on this side, or one that you want to work on more on that side. I practice on my husband all the time. So for me, it was really about supporting and encouraging. You know, like reading all these, I didn't get married till I was like 44, you guys, so I had a lot of thought about things. But I'm naming that to say that I was like, you know, reading about how men like encouraging words and like that kind of stuff. Like seriously, I mean, like these are things I'm reading because I've been single and dating like all this time. And so as I'm unpacking it, I'm like, wow, what does that kind of language really look like? Because I was raised with, if you're doing something well and you're doing the right thing, you don't get praised for it because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? So encouraging doesn't look the same for me as it looks for other people. I'm not gonna just throw encouragement around. It's so interesting because my teachers would come back to me and they'd say, you're not telling us that we're doing better. You're not telling us that we're doing good. But even though we are totally doing better, things are happening. And I'm thinking the data is like speaking for itself. But the data was above the green line. They just wanted to be stroked. That's below the green line. Okay, so that's how it starts to show up. Y'all with me? Okay, good. Okay, so when we talk about resilience, emotional regulation is part of resilience building. Emotional intelligence is part of resilience building. Resilience can be really hard to teach to others, and resilience can be hard to conceptualize. But basically, it's the ability to overcome obstacles along the way. Some people like to add on to there and not give up. Okay, I think that's kind of built in there, but that's some feedback that I got, like, say if you're not giving up. Okay, so you're not giving up, but you're overcoming obstacles along the way. And what does that look like, right? Resilience is scientifically proven to be cultivated on 3 levels. First is inner calm. Inner calm is consistently accessed via mindfulness and meditation. Okay, that is a way that we cultivate inner calm. There are several books over here that Matt and Lauren brought that also are full of activities that are mindful types of activities that again can create inner calm. Walking meditation, nature walks, observing, okay? Lots of things that just bring a sense of stillness and peace. The other is emotional resilience, emotional regulation, the sacred pause. Because again, people are getting more skillful about how to manage their emotions, which creates resilience, so that you're not acting out. You're not letting your tongue get you into other trouble. Okay, so how are we having self-governance? And how are we keeping a sense of equanimity, which is a fancy word for balance? How are we staying balanced? Resilient people are generally balanced because while the waves are doing all their thing, the resilience is there. You're gonna flow with the wave, okay? Lastly is our cognitive resilience, learning optimism. It's our explanatory style, and we can teach optimism. So basically that means when we're being faced with something that's challenging, what's the story that we're attaching to it? And how are we supporting our students in the types of stories that they're saying to themselves and to each other? Or how are they meaning making out of something? Okay, what is the explanatory style and how can we, in a sense, build a lesson? What's critical here in cultivating resilience, is that we have stories amongst ourselves of how we've been resilient, how we've made it through our educational system, how we've made it through tough situations that we know our students go through. Could be death of a parent, could be divorce, could be alcoholism, could be poverty. Those are things that we have made it through. But when we're above the green line, we want to show up like we're teachers and leaders and all this and like, you know, silver spoon. That's not so, and it's not inspiring. And by nature of the word, inspiring is in spirit. So how are you having literally a spiritual connection by sharing your story? Because it's inspiring to our students to know, wow, my teacher went through this and she's still successful. My teacher went through this and he's still able to connect with us. And of course, we have to share these things in age-appropriate ways, but again, it leads itself to inspiration. There's also studies that show that when we are sharing our stories, there's mirror neurons that happen in the brain, and hormones get released like dopamine. So we feel good listening to people's stories of resilience and triumph. That's why we like Lifetime movies. Okay, they're all the same movie. Right? They're all the same movie. But we're liking them every time. And we know the last 10 minutes is going to be like, can't miss the last 10 minutes. That's when she's going to just get supernatural in it. All right? But that's what it does. That's exactly what it does. That feeling that you get, that empowerment. Songs do it for us too. Okay? A powerful song will do it. I can hear Rocky to this day, a Rocky theme song, and I'm feeling stronger already and more resilient just by the nature of the emotional connection to experiencing that song at the movie theater. All right, so we can cultivate resilience in lots of ways. We can even play music for our students, but again, anchoring into our own story of resilience and then how do we share that. Your ACEs score, if you know your ACEs score, Adverse Childhood Experience score, we're not gonna do that today. If you know your score, I just wanna name that does not make you more or less resilient than anyone else, the higher your number, okay? You can have a 1 and not be resilient at all. You can have a 6 and be totally resilient. So do not equate whatever your ACEs score is with how resilient you are. That is not it, okay? The score is simply a score. It talked about your childhood. It explains some things. It gives us room for all this work, right? But otherwise, again, a lot of people who have low ACE scores generally experience guilt around that, or they feel like, what can I teach about, you know, overcoming obstacles? We've all dealt with obstacles. It's part of the work. All right. So moving into the mindfulness as an equity tool component. We're ready to move on? We're good? Okay. The inside-out work for our mindful leadership, for being with difficult emotions, for cultivating self-awareness, for having emotional resilience. This is a fancy graphic I made that talks about our lens. Our lens is how we view the world, okay? Which informs our values, beliefs, and assumptions, determines our interactions, influences how we be and how we do, and then impacts the outcomes that I experience. All from the power of my lens. How am I viewing what's happening? That lens in and of itself can be considered your bias, okay? For the sake of what we're talking about in this space, that lens can be your bias. I'm gonna show you how this plays out. So I started teaching, as I shared, when I was 22 years old. Should not have been in a classroom. I was with ninth graders, so yes, I was not much older than them at all. Glad they didn't give me the seniors. That would have been like way too close. And so there I am in my classroom. I only have about 24 students. Very diverse high school in an urban area of California. And my students are mostly black and brown. I have a sprinkling of white students, and I have one Asian student. And I remember where Robert was sitting to this day. I remember how the whole thing played out. Robert was my Asian student. I had a U-shaped classroom. He's sitting on this end. And I remember that first week of school just kind of looking around. It was in the first few days. And I look around in my classroom, and it's like I walked over in this area by Robert. I still continue to assess the situation. And my whole body language was like, you're good, you're not gonna need my help. Turned my back on Robert, looked at everybody else, and thought, okay, what's the work that's cut out for me in this experience? Why might I have done that with Robert? Stereotypes and stereotype threats, stereotypes. Why is it that everybody knows that's why I did that with Robert? Every time. That's the power of stereotypes and the power of bias. On top of that, I had a lived experience that even though that bias about Robert didn't serve Robert well for me, the bias wasn't negative. It's not a bad bias to have, right? But it's still a harmful bias because it impacted how I taught him and how he experienced me as his teacher in the classroom. And here we are purporting, all kids can learn. We take the whole oath, but what we bring our lens into our classrooms. We can't help but do it, which is why this work is also so important. So in my lived experience, I grew up in Los Angeles. Early elementary school days, I had a neighbor and a great friend named Kevin Pak. He was Korean. He did really great in school. He helped me with my homework. Then I moved past elementary school. I end up in Irvine from 4th grade, which is Orange County of California, very 90210-ish. I was the only black person in the entire school, not black child, black person at a K through 6 school, okay, of about 600 students. I'm experiencing white students, white people, Asian students, Asian people as very high achieving academically. So I'm also high achieving, I'm hanging in there. At the beginning of high school, I'm at a private school, and then my mother passes away. And so I end up going to live with my father, which was an inner city part, very urban part of Los Angeles. Okay, so now I'm at a high school that's 99% African American. In this high school, it's 99% African American. It feels like home to me. So it feels great. Academics, not so much. However, when it's graduation time, 99% African American high school, the valedictorian and salutatorian are Vietnamese. I leave Inglewood High School. I go on to UC Berkeley. All the classes I'm struggling in, the Asian students are excelling in. On top of that, I took an ethnic studies class at UC Berkeley and paid them to teach me that Asian people are smarter by the model minority. I mean, there's a whole name for it all. So I'm just saying, that's our conditioning. So what I'm sharing for you is, yes, I have that lens, but the lens is shaped by societal conditioning, familial conditioning. We get our conditioning honest, which is why I also name, especially for white people, we may have shame around our biases, but try your best to start to release the shame and have compassion, because you're getting them honestly through the conditioning. We are in a racialized society. It is doing what it was designed to do. We're just finally tired of it. And we're swinging it back in the other direction of humanity. The awareing is aware of what is arising right now in. That's the work of meditation. So when we sit in that space and we sit with the discomfort, We're being shown our conditioning, we're getting shown these relatives that didn't teach us so well about some of this stuff. We're sitting in that awareing so that we can unpack that bias and then reshape the lens, get it more in focus. Okay, that is the power of the inside out work for mindful leadership. That's what it does. That's how we can use this work as an equity tool. And when we get to this piece and expounding on Zaretta Hammond's work, the lens and conditioning and our emotions tell our bodies and minds what to do, because we are mostly water. And all of these hormones that are going through us, like cortisol, dopamine, oxytocin, all of that. So that creates the feeling tone in our schools and classrooms. It's the same thing as like what we call vibes, good vibes, bad vibes. When you walk into a room and it doesn't feel right, you know, people have been arguing. That's this at work. People are giving off enough of a hormonal, energetic, of cortisol, of a stress hormone, of angry emotions that are literally are palpable. It's a feeling tone. So when you go in a teacher's classroom and it's really dysregulated or it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel good, the teacher's the leader. The teacher in the space is the alpha energy. If your school is not feeling good and your culture climate's messed up, the principal is the alpha energy. The leadership will govern the feeling tone of the space at all times. And that's hard to hear for some people. But that is why this work is so important. And we know that our kids have a lot less layers of conditioning than we do, which is why I get so annoyed because we're not going to go do this work on kids. That's when we get it wrong. We have to do this really for ourselves. We get to do it with kids and teach them earlier, thank goodness, about these great wellness methods and how to release the conditioning. The thing is, you don't really even know the conditioning is being released. It's just happening. But this is, perfect example why. The bias also creates educational trauma. So the feeling tone in our schools is why kids will even say, oh, I'm not feeling it. Because they're really not feeling it. They're not feeling the love. They are not feeling the love.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Why is all this work extra important, particularly systemically for white people? Because it's white women really who are showing up as the teachers in our nation's schools, period. I'm okay with that as long as they do their work around what it means to serve kids of color. But that's why this work is so critical. And at the same time, it's hella uncomfortable. Robin DiAngelo wrote a whole book about it. Okay? There's a lot of behaviors, and so in doing that work, if you're gonna lead for equity, if you're gonna be more equitable in your classrooms, it's work that has to be unpacked. It just has to. And I share that story about Robert because I need to normalize bias. Bias is not something that only white people have. We all have it. And I swear every time I scan the room for someone who looks Asian to me, and I feel a sense of shame in sharing that story regardless, and then even more so when someone's in the room who looks Asian to me. And if you notice, I keep saying looks Asian. Why am I saying looks Asian?
You don't know their racial identity.
Thank you.
You don't know what that is or how they identify.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, as we grow on this journey, that is not language I would have used 5 years ago. I would have said, I think you're Asian. Right? I mean, I'm just gonna call that right. But I'm just saying. I mean, that's literally, but that's what happens on the journey. I think there's someone Asian in the room. But we don't know. And so we have to start living into that curiosity, living into the uncertainty of the space to grow and be in this work. Okay? And yes, it's uncomfortable, but remember, mindful leadership and having a meditation practice and practicing this work builds that capacity to be with how uncomfortable it gets. Right now, in this whole section when I get to the equity piece, especially in a room of mostly white people, I become the duck. I look hella calm, like I've been doing this for 20 years on top of that, but underneath I'm like, oh! Okay? It's uncomfortable work. It gets a little bit easier, but it's gonna stay uncomfortable. Okay. So, just remember that biases are malleable. They can be unlearned because they're learned. I teach at Mills College now. I get Asian students in my graduate programs now on trauma. And I check myself every single time. I use SBNRR every single time. Our biases are so ingrained, they will not go away. They're not gonna go away. But you can go from compulsion to choice in them. You do not have to act on them. Your highest and best self, the one in you that loves all kids, because that's what I firmly believe. We go into this profession because we absolutely love kids, but we bring our damn conditioning with us, and then that gets in the way. So when you check yourself and you use the principles involved, the methodology, then you allow yourself to stay in the love with the child. Okay? Love this one. Intellectualize the bias, but you can't intellectualize the actions and harm that result from it. I'll never be able to really explain to Robert. I can explain it, but it wasn't right. It was not right. Okay? So, this is the winning combination of why we even do the meditation and why it works for our equity work. Because the prefrontal cortex is about making that right choice of how we're going to teach and execute what we're doing. The insula is in the middle section of our brain, and it triggers empathy and compassion. We think that's happening purely in the heart. It's the brain, the insula of the brain, the connection. Remember on the slide? The connection. That's getting triggered when we meditate. And then lastly, the amygdala being less reactive, having that emotional regulation. It all gets activated. Amygdala, insula, PFC. And we've got to start from safety. I feel safe. In the past, jobs were about muscles. Now they're about brains. In the future, they'll be about the heart. So we've got to get to the work of the heart. Because we are swinging as a nation, as a world, into connection. That's where we're heading. I'm so grateful for it. Absolutely.
Best thing I've heard in a long time.
So we have some little bit of activity to do around some journaling and the power of journaling and how it works as a processing tool for us, and some mindful listening. So I'm going to invite you to use some paper. Does anyone need any paper? I'll give you a fancy hotel pad. Before we journal though, are there any questions? So we're going to journal on some prompts, and they'll have varied time. What the type of journaling that we're doing is called proprioceptive journaling, which means it's almost like free writing. It's a fancy word for free writing. So you're just not going to stop writing. You can lift your pen off the paper, but don't stop writing from whatever is your free-flowing consciousness. So I don't know what to say, I don't know what to say, whatever is coming to mind for you to write. Try to stay with the prompt, but things happen. Okay, so are we ready? Okay, first one. An unpleasant emotion I felt this past week was. I'm gonna give you about 1 minute for that one. An unpleasant emotion I felt this past week was. Keep writing, please, until the minute is up. When I reflect on this emotion and how it made me feel, both emotionally and physically, I remember feeling. When I reflect on this emotion and how it made me feel, both emotionally and physically, I remember feeling. Please keep writing until time is up. next prompt, what I did to handle the emotion was, and this made me feel. What I did to handle the emotion was, and this made me feel. Last one. If I could choose again how I handled my emotion, then I would. If I could choose again how I handled my emotion, then I would. So journaling supports us in processing emotions. Journaling is a wonderful activity to do with students on Mondays, to do with staff sometimes for the first 3 minutes of a staff meeting, maybe after some centering. It just allows things to happen. It's also a wonderful emotional regulation tool if you've had a difficult meeting or a difficult class period, whatever the case is, and it works in very little time, okay? I don't know what is the science behind why pen to paper or pencil to paper is more therapeutic in a sense and healing than typing. They both will process and they both work, but I've been told, and in my own experience, there's something about handwriting that is a little more impactful, if you will. Okay, so that's just something to think about. We are going to do a very short mindful listening activity that just allows us to practice some good listening through both how we embody being a good listener, so how is our posture, how are we showing up, what kind of eye contact might we be making, how are we holding the space for someone else, and the freedom of knowing that we don't have to respond, and how might that impact our listening. So I'm going to invite you to also practice some dual awareness in this, like you're being aware of what's happening for you internally and aware of also what you're holding in the exchange, if you will. So I'm gonna give you 2 prompts, how that activity felt for me and what I learned about myself and or the situation. Or a third option, because this is SEL, anything you want to talk about. Okay, but those are the 2 prompts. You need to just pair up, and so it's important to, you know, be facing the person, not really angled. Each person's gonna get 2 minutes uninterrupted. The fun part is if you stop before your 2 minutes, you get to just sit and be together in silence. I know, right? Everybody giggles at that, but think about that. Just think about that. And then I'll ring the bell when the 2 minutes is up, and then the other person's turn will be to talk. Okay, so please pair up. Does anyone not have a partner? All right, cool. The person with the longest fingernails will go first. The person with the
Vice versa. And I love my assistant principal that way. We'll be like,
Please thank your partner. So we are closing out this segment and gonna go into our break and then finish the rest of the afternoon. Does anyone want to say or share or ask anything?
That was great. I'm usually the one listening, and it was great to be able to have the opportunity to talk and have someone listen.
I was trying to remember the last 2 prompts because I remembered like the first 2, I was free flowing, and then the last 2, I was like, like it gave me some pause to really think about that, you know? And then even the next one, it was a good exercise for me.
And we journaled about 5 minutes. So generally, when we have more time, I do like 2 minutes per prompt, no matter what, because these were shaped a little different. And if you notice too, the prompts generally ended with how you felt. So when you're crafting prompts for your students to write, and when you're doing it even for yourself, you want to try to get it to end in feel so that you go into the feeling space, not up here. Okay.
I can share some of the science of the handwriting.
Right.
I can't remember the reference to the study, but when you're handwriting versus when you're typing, more parts of your brain light up because of all the connectivity with the handwriting, and very, very little actually lights up when you're typing. Yeah.
That's why email can be draining.
Yeah.
No, very nice.
Yeah, but like
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I remember, like in college, taking notes, and then people would go and type their notes later, and I tried that a couple times, but when I studied from typed, because of also the visual connection of shapes and patterns, yeah, it was much easier to study off of handwritten.
Me too, because I also draw things,
Yeah.
and I could hold that.
Yeah, yeah.
Sherry Turkle's research on devices and how they impact our attention. A screen, this represents so many other possibilities than the task you're currently working on. And that's always implicit in your mind, is knowing that it can go somewhere else with where you are. Whereas this, this is not suddenly going to become the weather update, and then ESPN.com, and then so you're able to actually calibrate your attention to it with a fullness that you wouldn't get on this.
Thank you.
Also, my husband and I watched a documentary on the swipe down. You guys know where that comes from? When you refresh something on your phone, it comes from a slot machine.
Yeah.
And the whole like algorithm behind it is from that addictive. Does anybody play slots? I don't do that. Like I've never even done it.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's endorphins, right? And when you either if you're gonna win or not, people enjoy it. So it's the same motion.
Wow.
And the guy in the documentary who created it was so sorry because of how it's affected humans' brains and our behavior. And it was very interesting. But again, like the parts of your brain that are engaged with the
Thank you. So what can we do now with just some of what we've already learned? Because remember, we're starting with self-awareness. And as you grow in this, and even again using the book and other books, you'll see how to bring it on an integrated level into the work. It should never be done as an addition. Remember, it's bell-to-bell experience. Okay? Start with you, the commit to 1%. Tracy, commit to 1%. All right? Journaling on our emotions up to 5 minutes a day. You know, sometimes, Anne, I'm thinking you might need to be in your car before you even hit the door. I spend some time in my driveway before I hit the door, because sometimes I need that shift so that I can show up with more connection habits for my husband versus coming in this like whirlwind. Okay? Practicing the sacred pause on your bias, on your habits, your behaviors, and of course experiment and discover. It is definitely free flow of information out there, and I really report too that there's no right or wrong in this. It's what feels right for you, and is it working for you? Because there's so many different ways to practice and what people are doing. So I would love to stay connected to you all. If you're interested in something like that, you're free to text Conscious to that number. And we have a 15-minute break in our lives that's going to start now at 2:07.
We get to plan our individual slot machines now.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.
I'd like to hear.
I'll ring the bell.
I'd love to hear just a little bit more how you possibly initiate
To make a
mindfulness within your builders. Like, I know it started with the adults part of it, but like, it didn't. No? Okay.
So, well, I did start with the adults, but I didn't do like systemically.
Okay.
So I started talking about it because I had my own practice already. So and then I started doing it at staff meetings where we would do like 2 minutes. It was totally optional. That's it. And the people who were resistors, who like wanted to be there, one was that union woman. She just wanted to sit there, and I just knew, I'm like, even though she's sitting there and doing nothing,
She's doing
guess
what?
what? She's sitting there doing nothing.
bracelets.
Just do it.
Like, So I just giggled to myself about that. But anyways, that's a digression of the ego. People who were more resistant started getting on board with it because it just felt good.
Yeah.
And I would just say, you know what, we've just transitioned in here. Let's just take a minute to know that all of our kids are out of our classrooms and here we are in this space. So that would be it. And we would just sit and breathe quietly. And 3 minutes most. Then I started talking about my practice more and how I used to do it with kids. Then that gave permission for the people who were secretly doing it. There are people doing it probably on campus already. They started coming out. Oh, Toby, I've been, oh, I'm so glad you talked about, oh, did you know I do it like, so I was like, oh, that's great. So I just stayed encouraging with it. Then I brought in Inner Explore. And they did a 30-minute thing at the staff meeting.
Oh, a group.
A group, exactly, sorry. I brought in a group, Inner Explore, and they did a 30-minute piece in a staff meeting, and then they had some free access tools to pilot. So I just said, if anyone's interested, go for it. It works, and so more people just started doing it. It was really about the teachers getting other teachers. That's generally how it works, the stuff that feels.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah, so that was it, and we were just off to the races. My big thing was more around this kind of work, but I was doing it intuitively because there wasn't language for me at that time.
Right.
So one of the things I even implemented was like, we have to say hi in the hallways.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the adults were not even saying hello to each other in the hallways. I'm like, this is ridiculous. How are we gonna have a campus that feels good if people are not even speaking out of courtesy? So I just started unpacking stuff like that. And so between, everything that was starting to happen, I also had teachers go on Shadow a Student.
Thanks for listening.
And we picked
At lunch.
She spoke at the.
Oh, at lunch she was saying that, yeah, okay, yeah.
So 4 different types of students, AP student, EL student, regular student, and a black boy. And we picked 4 schedules, and I just said, because all teachers think that everyone is as good as them. Like your good teachers, they think their peers are that good. I'm like, no, and I couldn't convince them in curriculum council meetings and principals cabinets. I'm like, your peers suck. And that's what I wanted to say. I'm like, the things I'm seeing, I'm like, I'm going into 65 classrooms. You're not. you're in your one little world, or you're planning with the other colleague who is as great as you, and so you think everybody is. No.
Because you like them personally.
And that's
Right,
the other
right,
piece, and
right.
because they like them, they don't wanna give them real feedback. And so when we did that shadow thing, and it came from the teachers, because I kept going on and on, they're like, what are you talking about? And they're like, you know what, maybe we need to see it for ourselves. I said, yes, you do.
Was there like some sort of reflection that they did after that?
So there was supposed to be,
Okay.
but the union,
Yeah, of course.
said you can't write anything down.
Okay.
And I was
No
fine
one
with it, 'cause it
evaluated
didn't matter.
manner or whatever.
But
Yeah, they
also
felt
they
that
couldn't
was
write
going that
anything
way.
down.
Yeah.
And I just kept stressing, we're not really looking at teachers. We're looking at the quality of the experience that the
practice
students
is,
are having.
yeah.
So that language was important.
Yes.
What's happening with our students? And, oh my God, they were supposed to debrief with me after. They didn't. They literally said, Toby, we're not gonna debrief with you, but we're gonna try what it is you want us to try. And that's what I gave them, my list of 30-something things.
Yeah.
And we didn't do all of that, we went through a whole process around what we could do around that, but it was around creating a calmer, more systemic culture for our students. And to get, you know, about 80 teachers to be on board to do some things the exact same way. And the mascot is the Rebels. It was quite an adventure.
Yeah.
But we did it and it worked.
And how long have you been there?
I left. Because the system will always correct itself.
Well, how long were you there before you left?
Funny story, I was there when I was 22. I left because I got so disheartened about what was happening. I left for about 10 years and I came back, so I was principal there for 4 years.
Okay.
After being a teacher there.